Yeah. Hello and Jai Bhim to everyone. Welcome to this second session of today's Ambedkar Intellectual Summit Online 2024. Uh, I am Prateek from doing Masters in Jawaharlal Nehru University in International Relations. Uh, I'll be moderating this session with the help of Nisha. Nisha, please.
So, hi everyone, myself Nisha Sharma, and I am graduated from Shyam Prasad Mukherjee College in History Honours and currently pursuing LLB from Chaudhry Charan Singh University. And I am thrilled to be serving as Prateek's moderator. And yeah, Prateek, over to you.
Thank you, Nisha. So our last session was on the evolution of educational paradigms that Meenal explained. That was based on the Ambedkar's theory of higher education. This session will be given by Uday Jain. He has a topic on W.E.B. DuBois and Ambedkar's both educational paradigms. So, to give a brief bio of Uday, his research and teaching focuses on the question of education and the promises and its limits it holds in the collective pursuit of freedom. His dissertation from the abolition of untouchability to a philosophy of liberatory education, B.R. Ambedkar and W.E.B. Du Bois in dialogue brings into this view of work of the two central to the liberatory tradition of South Asian South Asian anti-caste political movement and black political thought that is emerging in United States and other European centers. So both Uday explores the engagement between the both two. He has a passion about teaching and writing. Uday's thinking and praxis as a scholar has transformed from the feminist tradition across the world. Uh, Constantly thinking about the condition of possibility for love and justice. Uday is also an organizer in Chicago Mehfil, a Chicago-based South Asian performing arts space open to all and intent to breaking the barriers imposed by caste in South Asia. He was also a proud organizer of Graduate Student Union in U Chicago and remains committed to the cause of worker organizing and is now working to make visible and scale up the intimate but often invisibilized connection between the anti-caste movement in South Asia and the Black liberation movement in the world over. So now, Uday, I would like to uh, give the floor to you. Welcome.
Hi, thank you everyone. Thank you, Prateek. Thank you, Nisha. And also my thanks to Mangesh sir and Yogesh sir for creating this really beautiful set of lectures. I think it's really the perfect way to celebrate Dr. Ambedkar Jayanti. So yeah, Jai Bhim to everyone. And I just want to kind of start with a kind of statement of solidarity that coming from a dominant caste and dominant class background, I expect to be held to levels of accountability and standards of critical thought that are expected of me. So please, I'm really excited to hear your questions, hear your feedback. If there's something I've gotten completely wrong, like I love learning, and like I love kind of growing, and I think that's what education and learning is really all about. So I kind of wanted to start with that. So the lecture I'm going to give today, Outthinking the Owners of the World, Dr. W.E.B. Du Bois and Dr. B.R. Ambedkar on the Purpose of Public Education, is broadly about kind of why I believe that the kind of often invisibilized connections between the Black liberation movement and the Dalit liberation movement can be understood through the question of this right to think, the right for education. So I will get to the right to think kind of as let me just activate my screen sharing so you can see my slides. And I can share these slides with you, after the talk as well. So let me go to full screen. So the outline of the lecture is I will give a brief a brief outline of their lives of movement. I really want to argue that Dr. Ambedkar and Dr. Du Bois, as visionary leaders as they were led by the movement around them. that they were part of a movement, and they were ordinary people who had extraordinary ideas, like all of us, I would argue. And also, I will talk about the educational conjuncture. So historically, what was the situation of educational access, and what was education being used for by the ruling castes and the ruling classes? And why was it uniquely challenging for Black people and for Dalits? And basically, my argument is that for Dr. Ambedkar and for Dr. DuBois, education was how you could abolish untouchability. In a sense, I'll kind of, in my conclusion, talk about what happens when untouchability is legally abolished, but still, as we know, practically practiced and enforced through social violence in the second half of the 20th century. So I want to start with bringing out the voices of Dr. DuBois and Dr. Ambedkar. So we'll start with this. This is a recording of Dr. DuBois towards the end of his life. So around 1962, when the American student movements are starting.
Lately, I've been encouraged by the fact that the young people, the students, have resumed leadership, which I was afraid that they had given up during the McCarthy era. I spoke at several institutions. I spoke at Princeton and Chicago, and I think the University of Illinois, quite a number, but the students didn't respond. They seemed to me awfully dull. And I just made up my mind that this was an age where we were not going to have the inspiration of the young. And now suddenly, without any encouragement on my part and little encouragement on the part of others, comes this sit down, where the students have put their finger on a very important point. The Negro problem, of course, is a problem of mob violence and of disfranchisement and of injustice in the courts and of difficulties of getting decent jobs. It's all that. But in addition to that, the Negro problem is a series of little meannesses which are really unimportant, that help nobody, and yet which all of the Negroes have to meet, and which most of them simply meet and say nothing. I mean, the fact that you go downtown shopping, you can't get a sandwich or a cup of coffee. There are towns down there where you can't sit in the park. You can't go to the movies, or if you do go, you have to go to a very unpleasant place at the top. All sorts of things of that kind, which have been going on, and which, in my day, we simply said, well, gracious, we've got to stop people being murdered if they can't get a cup of coffee. That's a little thing. But the students put their finger on that, and they fought, and it was hard fighting. I went down to North Carolina and saw some of them and heard the story of what they've been doing. And they've kept it up. And it's really a part of a worldwide movement of students. The students in Turkey who made it impossible for Mr. Menderes to give his welcoming speech to NATO. To the tremendous revolution in South Korea, where they got rid of a scoundrel, and of other student movements. And then, of course, the great awakening of Africa. Well, that gives me a great deal of satisfaction. Evidently, the older people like myself are not needed just now. They're younger people who are going on and doing their own thinking. And I congratulate them on it. They don't need any advice from me. Perhaps I need some from them.
So as you heard in the lecture, or as in the recording just now, what Dr. DuBois was talking about was the student movements of the 1960s. And he himself was an accomplished intellectual. I'll kind of go into his journey, but he was commenting how in the 1950s, when there was a massive repression, the McCarthyite kind of fear of communism taking over American student campuses, most students were dull. And he went to the most elite institutions. He went to Princeton, he went to Harvard. And students weren't raising questions. They weren't challenging the little meannesses of racism. But in the 1960s, when students were doing sit-downs in the South, in the most violent cities, in the most white supremacist, hateful cities, that's where the students were fighting. And also, I want us to kind of pay attention to how he says that the Negro problem, or the problem of Black people, is a series of little meannesses that everyone has to put up with, that you can't go to the theater, you can't buy a cup of coffee. Does it sound familiar to, the Dalit problem of untouchability? That the little meannesses, the little contempts, the little ways in which people kind of try to trace somebody's name, try to trace somebody's category or status, and then after that, they immediately start downplaying. And of course, one might think, oh, we have to kind of solve the big atrocities and violences happening, but the little meannesses also add up. And what Dr. DuBois is bringing out, that what was radical about the student movement and also about the Ambedkarite movement is that it fights both the little meannesses and the atrocities. That in a sense, education and pedagogy, like true education, not false education, is about challenging how those meannesses even happen. So I want to share a couple of videos that might be familiar to both of you, but to all of us who are kind of steeped in the Ambedkarite tradition of study. But I really want to bring out for us, and I'm sure Amina might have discussed this in terms of paradigms of Ambedkarite education as well, that the right to read books is a very radical demand in Dalit history and in South Asian history. So there were a couple of videos I wanted to play just to kind of, again, center us within the context that we're in. So let me just find the correct timing. I'll play this as the voice of Madhukar Takshande, but who is I'll start with this video.
बादमध्ये झालं ना, मग कुठलाही बसवल्याच्या बादमध्ये काही दिवसानं झालं दीक्षाभूमीचा पाया फक्त येथे मला साऱ्या लोकांनी साथ दिला बेटा, आणि मी याच्या भरोश्यावर अजय धंदा करत आहो. माझी वय आता 82ची होईल खतम याच्यामध्ये. मी मधुकर ताकसांडे. मी 1956 ला बाबासाहेब धर्मांतर झालं त्यावेळेस आमचे काका समता सैनिक दलामध्ये होते. आमच्या घराणं जे आहे पूर्ण आंबेडकर चळवळीमध्ये असे काका समता सैनिक दलामध्ये. तर समता सैनिक दल उंटखान्याच्या दीक्षाभूमीवर गेला होता. तर त्यावेळेस काय आहे की जेथे आता म्हणजे जेथे डोम वगैरे लागतात त्या ठिकाणी पूर्व पश्चिम जसे मिलिटरीचे कॅम्प लागतात. 74 पासूनच चालू झालेला आणि 1974 पासून आम्ही दीक्षाभूमीवर बुक स्टॉल लावत आहे. त्याच्यापूर्वी 74च्या पूर्वी दीक्षाभूमीवर वगैरे दुकानं फार कमी लागत होती त्या ठिकाणी. तर त्या ठिकाणी आम्ही तिथे पुस्तकं विकत होतो. त्याच्यावरून मग कल्पना आली की बा या दीक्षाभूमीवर जे स्टॉल आहेत असे जर लावले बाकीचे तर बाकीचे बी चालू शकतात. त्या हिशोबाने मग सुरुवात केली आम्ही. 1974 ला त्या ठिकाणी दुकानाची स्थापना जी आहे ते उंटाखाना मेडिकल चौकला लावलेली आहे. आणि पूर्ण बाबासाहेबांनी बुद्ध साहित्य हेच विकलं जातं. तर त्यात पुढे चालून मग पब्लिकेशन वाढलं, लोक मग यायला लागले. त्याच्यामुळे लोक स्वतः पुस्तकं घ्यायला लागले. फक्त पुस्तकं जे आहेत ते फक्त आपल्या आंबेडकर समाजातील लोक स्वतः म्हणजे विकत घेऊन म्हणजे वाचतात. बाकी समाजामध्ये कोणी पुस्तकं विकत घेत नाही, काही नाही. हा समाज असा आहे की हा बाबासाहेब वाचतो, बुद्ध वाचतो, पण फुले झालं, साहू झालं, नायकर झालं, हे सगळेच वाचतो. पुस्तकं स्वतः घेऊन वाचतात, लोक खरेदी करतात. खेड्यापाड्यामध्ये सगळीकडे जे काही आंदोलन जे पेटत आहे त्या पुस्तकामुळेच पेटत. जसं मराठवाडा विद्यापीठाचं आंदोलन वगैरे झालं त्या काळामध्ये मराठवाड्यामध्ये खूप पुस्तकं गेली त्या ठिकाणी. तर खेड्यापाड्यातले लोक प्रत्येक मनुष्य इथे खेड्यापाड्यातून येतात ते पुस्तकं घेऊन जातात. हे विशेषतः आहे. दुसरीकडे दुसऱ्या मेळावे काय भरतात तिथे, पण इथे जे येणारा मनुष्य जो आहे तो प्रसाद म्हणून तो पुस्तकं विकत घेऊन जातो स्वतः. आणि प्रत्येकाकडे जसं सगळ्यात जास्त विक्री म्हटलं तर बुद्धी आणि धम्माची होते. दुसरं मिलिंद प्रश्न या पुस्तकांची होते. आता त्रिपिटकाचं वगैरे बरंच भाषांतर झालेलं आहे, त्याची विक्री होते.
धम्मचक्र प्रवर्तन भी.
So yeah, I wanted to show the story that Madhukar Taksande is sharing in this beautiful documentary, Awakening History and Memories of Historic Diksha Bhumi, because he's kind of demonstrating what was happening since the 1930s, since the 1920s, from the beginning of the Ambedkarite movement and even from the Fuleite movement, that reading books, distributing books, books that described what caste was, how to annihilate caste, reading Ghulam Giri by Jyotirao Phule, reading Periyar, reading Buddhist literature, were all part of the kind of ground-up anti-caste movement that has revolutionized Indian society. And denying the right to read, denying the right to think, was how upper castes and was how the British colonial state and the Indian state wanted to control and manage these insurgent social movements. And finally, I wanted to share this beautiful interview with Pa Ranjit, a famous director from Tamil Nadu. And he talks about, many people ask me, why am I writing about Dr. DuBois, Dr. Ambedkar? Why am I connecting the Dalit struggle, the Black struggle? It's so different. Race and caste are so different. And they are. I think it's important to look at the differences. But there's a way in which the Black liberation movement has, by Dalits themselves, by Dr. Ambedkar, but even by Periyarites, and even by Pa Ranjit, there's a way in which Black struggle and the iconicity, the art, the aesthetics of Black struggle has provided inspiration and energy and a connection to the Dalit struggle for freedom. So I'll just share just some of this interview now, where Pa Ranjit is reflecting on his own relationship with Black art, which might
உங்க
be interesting.
படங்கள் எல்லா இடத்துலயும் பார்க்கப்படுது. நார்த் இந்தியா, சவுத் இந்தியா எல்லாரும் உங்களை பத்தி பேசுறாங்க. ஸோ டு கெட் தட் ஃபீலிங் இப்ப?
டெஃபினட்டா சொல்றேன். இங்க வந்து எதிர்க்கிற மனநிலை இருக்கிற அதே சமயத்துல தான் ஆதரவு மனநிலையும் இருக்கு. நான் யாருன்றது, நான் பேசுறது அப்படின்றது சில பேர் மற்றும் 3 விதமான மனநிலை இருக்கு. ஒண்ணு வந்து எதிர்ப்பு, இன்னொன்னு வந்து நீ எதுக்கு இதை பத்தி பேசிட்டு இருக்கிறன்னு சொல்றது, இன்னொன்னு வந்து ஆமா நீ பேசுன்னு சொல்றது. மற்ற 3 இருக்குதுல்ல, அந்த 3 பேரும் வந்து என்ன டிஸ்கஷன் பண்ற இடமே வந்து அக்செப்ட்னு தான் நான் நினைக்கிறேன். நீ என்னை பத்தி உரையாடாமல் நீ கடந்து போறன்னா தான் பிரச்சனை. என்னை பத்தி உனக்கு வந்து உரையாடணும்னு தோணுது, என்னை பத்தி யோசிக்கணும்னு தோணுது, முதல்ல என்னை திட்டணும்னு தோணுது, அப்புறம் என்னை விமர்சிக்கணும்னு தோணுது, என்னை ஆதரிக்கணும்னு தோணுது. அப்ப இந்த 3 விஷயம் ஒரே டைம்ல வந்து ஸ்டார்ட் ஆகுது அப்படின்றப்பவே இது வந்து எனக்கு வந்து ஒரு வெற்றின்னு தான் நான் நினைக்கிறேன்.
நீங்க அம்பேத்கர் பத்தி பேசுனீங்க, பெரியாரை பத்தி பேசுனீங்க கொஞ்சம். அதோட நீங்க வந்து நிறைய இந்த அமெரிக்காவில் நடந்த பிளாக் மூவ்மெண்ட் பத்தி நிறைய பேசியிருக்கீங்க. அந்த எக்ஸ்போஷர் உங்களுக்கு எப்போ கிடைச்சது?
ஆக்சுவலி மூவி தான். டெஃபினட்டா வந்து நான் பார்த்த ஸ்பைக்லியோட மால்கம் மேக்ஸ், ஆக்சுவலி அந்த படம் வந்து எனக்குள்ள வந்து ஒரு மிகப்பெரிய மாற்றத்தை உண்டாக்குச்சு அப்படின்னு நான் நினைக்கிறேன். ஆக்சுவலி வந்து இந்த புக்கு படிக்கிறது தான் இது என்னை அங்கே நோக்கி கொண்டு போச்சுன்னு நான் நினைக்கிறேன். ஆக்சுவலி வந்து இந்த பிளாக் சினிமாவை பத்தி யாரோ எழுதியிருந்தாங்க. நான் தொடர்ந்து நான் காலேஜ் படிக்கிற டைம்ல சிற்றிதழ்களை அதிகமாக வாசிப்பேன். காலச்சுவடு, உயிர்மை, தீராநதி, அப்புறம் சினிமா சம்பந்தமான நிழல் பத்திரிகை. இப்ப இது எல்லாமே நான் தலித் முரசு முக்கியமா இப்ப இந்த மாதிரி சிற்றிதழ்களை நான் வாசிக்கிறப்ப இது வந்து எனக்கு இப்ப தலித் முரசு வந்து முழுக்க முழுக்க அரசியல் சார்புடைய ஒரு பத்திரிகையா இருக்கும். அப்புறம் இலக்கிய இது வந்து இப்ப காலச்சுவடு, உயிர்மை இதெல்லாம் வந்து இலக்கியம் பிளஸ் வந்து அரசியல் இது டிஸ்கஷன் பண்றதா இருக்கும். அப்புறம் சினிமா சம்பந்தமான சிற்றிதழ்களும் அந்த டைம்ல நிறைய வந்துட்டு இருக்கு. இன்னொரு இவர் செந்தில்நாதன் ஒரு பத்திரிகையை கொண்டு வந்திருந்தாரு. அப்ப நிறைய இருந்தது இந்த மாதிரியான இதழ்கள்லாம் இருக்கிறப்ப நான் தொடர்ந்து வாசிக்கிறப்போ இப்போ வந்து என்னன்னா வெளிநாட்டு திரைப்படங்கள்ல நமக்கு வந்து பாக்குறதுக்குமான ஒரு அண்டர்ஸ்டாண்ட் பண்றதுக்குமான புரிஞ்சுக்கிறதுக்குமான ஒரு வெளி வந்து கிடைச்சு. அப்படிதான் நான் வந்து மால்கம் எக்ஸ் வந்து ஃபர்ஸ்ட் டைம் பார்த்தேன். அப்ப மால்கம் எக்ஸ பாக்குறப்போ அந்த படமும் நானும் வேற ஒன்னா தோணல எனக்கு. அது எனக்கு ஒரு பெரிய ஒரு அஃபெக்ஷனை எனக்கு வந்து கிரியேட் பண்ணுச்சு. குறிப்பா ரூட்ஸ், அலெக்ஸ் ஹேலியோட ரூட்ஸ் இருக்குல்ல, ரூட்ஸ் படிச்சதுக்கு அப்புறம் வந்து நான் வந்து ஒரு பெரிய மன உளைச்சலுக்கு வந்து ஆளானேன். எங்கேயோ இந்த இந்த கண்டம் வேற, அந்த கண்டம் வேற, அப்படியே வந்து ஒரு பெரிய ஒரு கேப் இருக்கு. ஆனா அந்த அந்த இடத்துல ஒருத்தன் நான் வாழ்ந்த வாழ்க்கைய ஒருத்தன் வாழ்ந்திருக்கிறான், ஒரு அப்ரேஷனுக்குள்ள அவன் இருந்திருக்கிறான், அவனுடைய லைஃப் என் லைஃப் வேற ஒண்ணும் இல்லைன்றப்போ வந்து எனக்கு ஈஸியா என்ன வந்து பிளாக்ஸோட என்னால வந்து கனெக்ட் பண்ணிக்க முடிஞ்சது. ஆக்சுவலி அலெக்ஸ் ஹேலியில வர அவ்வளவு, அந்த ரூட்ஸ்ல வர அவ்வளவு கேரக்டர்லாம் வந்து பயங்கரமா இருந்திருக்கும். ஒவ்வொரு முறையும் அவன் தப்பிச்சு போறது, மாட்டிக்கிறது, இந்த மாதிரி விஷயங்கள்லாம் வந்து பாக்குறப்போ வந்து அப்படியே எனக்கு வந்து இங்கே வந்து இந்திய சுதந்திர போராட்ட காலகட்டத்துக்கு முன்னாடி கம்பெனி ஆட்கள் வந்து இங்கிருந்து மக்களை வந்து ரீஅலோகேட் பண்றாங்க. இங்கிருந்து தூக்கின்னு போயிட்டு மலேசியா, சிங்கப்பூர், அப்புறம் வந்து ஃபிஜி, அப்புறம் அந்த ஷியாம் ரயில், மரண ரயில் பாதைன்னு சொல்லுவாங்கல்ல. இப்ப அந்த இடத்துல வந்து மக்களை வந்து ஒர்க்கர்ஸை கூப்பிட்டு போறது, அப்புறம் இலங்கையில வந்து கிட்டத்தட்ட பெரிய எண்ணிக்கையிலான மக்களை வந்து ரீஅலோகேட் பண்ணது, அந்த மாதிரி எக்கச்சக்கமா இந்த கதை ஏற்கனவே நடந்திருக்குது. ஏன்னா ஒயிட்ஸ் ஆல்ரெடி பிராக்டிஸ் பண்ணிருக்கிறான். பிளாக்ஸை கூப்பிட்டு வந்து அவங்கள வந்து ஒரு பயங்கரமா கஷ்டப்படுத்தி அவங்கள வேலை வாங்கலாம், அடிமைப்படுத்தி வேலை வாங்கலாம். அதே இது வந்து இங்க வந்து அப்ளை பண்ணிருக்கோம். அப்ப இதை யோசிக்கிறப்ப வந்து ரெண்டும் ஒன்னா ஃபர்ஸ்ட் தோணுச்சு. அப்புறம் பிளாக்ஸோட வெற்றி என்ன, பிளாக்ஸோடைய ஏன் இவ்வளவு வந்து பவர்ஃபுல்லா இன்னைக்கு உலகம் முழுக்க இருக்கிறாங்க அப்படின்னு யோசிக்கிறப்ப அவன் வந்து ஆர்ட்டை வந்து ரொம்ப சாலிடா பயன்படுத்திருக்கிறான். ஓகே, மாவோ வந்து ஆர்ட் வந்து ஒரு முக்கியமான பொலிட்டிக்கல் வெப்பன் சொல்றாரு, ஒரு அரசியல் ஆயுதம் சொல்றாரு. அப்ப அந்த அரசியல் ஆயுதம் வந்து ரொம்ப கரெக்டா பயன்படுத்தினது என்ன கேட்டீங்கன்னா வந்து பிளாக்ஸ் சொல்லுது. ஆக்சுவலி வந்து திராவிடன் கல்ச்சர், திராவிடன் மூவ்மெண்ட் வந்து ஆர்ட்டை பயங்கரமா பயன்படுத்தி இருக்கிறாங்க அதே சேம் டைம்ல. அப்ப நம்ம இந்த கல்ச்சர்ல இருந்து வரப்போ அவங்கள பாக்குறப்போ வந்து அவங்க வந்து நான் இப்போ நியூயார்க் போனேன் நான். அந்த டைம்ல பாத்தீங்கன்னா வந்து பிளாக்ஸ்க்குன்னு தனி மியூசியம்ஸ் இருக்குது. ஆர்ட் அவங்க வந்து ஆர்டிஸ்டிக்கா இந்த 400 ஆண்டு காலத்துல பிளாக்ஸ் என்ன பண்ணிருக்கான்ற வந்து டாக்குமெண்ட் இருக்குது. அந்த டாக்குமெண்ட்டை பாக்குறப்போ, டாக்குமெண்ட்டை படிக்கிறப்போ, அந்த விஷுவல்ஸை பாக்குறப்போ நமக்கே வந்து ஒரு வைப்ரேஷன் கிரியேட் ஆகுது. ஏன் இந்த மாதிரி வந்து இங்க வந்து பண்ணவே இல்லை, இவ்வளவு ஒரு என்ன சொல்றது, ஒரு சாலிடான ஒரு விக்டரி அவங்களால வந்து பெற முடிஞ்சது, நம்மளால ஏன் இது வந்து பண்ண முடியல, இங்க ஏன் இந்த மாதிரியான சினிமாவோ ஆர்ட்டோ எங்க ஏன் உருவாகல அப்படின்ற கேள்வி எனக்கு கொஞ்சம் கொஞ்சமா தான் வருது ஆக்சுவலி. அப்புறம் வந்து நான் பார்த்த வந்து இவரு முகமது அலியோட அலி அப்படின்ற ஒரு படம், அதுக்கப்புறம் வந்து அது தொடர்ந்து நிறைய படங்கள் வந்து நம்ம வந்து பிளாக்ஸ் வந்து நான் தேடி தேடி பாக்குறப்போ வந்து எனக்கு அந்த கல்ச்சர் அவங்க அத ஒரு ஆர்ட் வெப்பனா பயன்படுத்திக்கிட்டது எனக்கு ரொம்ப பிடிச்சது. குறிப்பா மியூசிக்லாம் வந்து அவங்க
So the link is on the slide, so I encourage you all to read and listen to the interview. It's very rich from Ranjit. And I think Yogesh Maithur has done incredible work, and many others have done incredible work on Ambedkarite Shahirs, on how music was so much part of the Ambedkar movement in Maharashtra, in changing the kind of normalization of untouchability and challenging it and kind of naming upper caste domination and upper caste hypocrisy. But it's very powerful to see that in a sense, the connection between the Black struggle and the Dalit struggle was made by Dalit intellectuals themselves. And it's been made over the course of the 20th century. And it was because of a larger, I argue, a larger struggle against untouchability that both of them shared, that both struggles shared, which is why it was possible to even see that these were similar experiences. So I won't spend so much time on Dr. Ambedkar's trajectory and his life, because we're in a Ambedkarite kind of audience and community. But one thing I will emphasize was that similar to Dr. DuBois, he had a global trajectory. He thought globally. That he saw the question of untouchability as unique in South Asia, but connected to questions of anti-Semitism, connected to questions of slavery, connected to questions of anti-Black racism. And that's because he went to New York in 1913. He went to London in 1916. And he read very widely. He did, 2 PhDs. And came back to Mumbai, and then over the 20s and 30s undertook kind of, social movement work with hundreds of thousands of other Dalits, but also people from all castes who risked their lives to kind of ensure the abolition of untouchability by the 1950 Indian Constitution. And finally, he also converts to Buddhism, and Buddhism becomes part of his educational project. I want to share a picture of Dr. Ambedkar in his historic speech at Yola, where he says he will not die a Hindu. And I just wanted to kind of finally also play a little clip from Dr. Ambedkar as well, to kind of ground our talk about what untouchability, which I'm sure we're all familiar about, but kind of just to kind of bring the links between Madhukar Taksande, DuBois, and the Little Meannesses, Ranjit's experiences of untouchability in Tamil Nadu, and then now Dr. Ambedkar's own voice, which I think, always needs to be heard on, especially.
He only wanted, you see, there are two things about his Harijan, you see, and the Gagan.
And what were his real intentions with regard to the scheduled castes in the structure?
Well, he only wanted, you see, there are two things about the scheduled caste. We want untouchability to be abolished, you see, but we also want, you see, that we must be given equal opportunities, you see, so that we may rise to the level of the other classes. Mere washing off of untouchability is of no consequence. We have been carrying on with untouchability for the last 2000 years. Nobody has bothered about it, you see, nobody has bothered about it. Yes, there are some disabilities which are very harmful. For instance, people can't take water, people can't have land, you see, to cultivate and earn their livelihood. But the other things which are far more important, you see, namely that they should have the same status, you see, in the country, and that they should have the opportunity to hold high offices so that not only their dignity will rise, but also they will get what I call strategic positions from which they could protect their own people. Mr. Gandhi was totally opposed. Totally opposed. You see?
He was content with things like temple entry.
Temple entry, that was all the things that he wanted to do. You see? You see? Which is a very, nobody cares for Hindu temples now. The untouchables have become, you see, so conscious of the fact that temple going is of no consequence at all. You see, you live in the untouchable quarters, just the same, whether you went into the temple or whether you did not go into the temple. You see, people, just as for instance, people at one time would not allow the untouchables to travel by railway, you see, because of pollution. You see? But now they don't mind because the railways won't make any separate arrangement. But because they travel together in the train, it doesn't follow, you see, that their life in the villages vis-a-vis the Hindus has in any sense changed. You see, whenever the Hindu and the untouchable alights at a railway train, you see, they assume their old robes. You see?
So you would say Gandhi was an orthodox Hindu?
Yes, he was absolutely an orthodox Hindu. You see, he was never a reformer.
So as you can see in this talk, in his critique of Gandhi and the abolition of untouchability, is that Gandhi believed that if you could abolish untouchability but keep the Varna system, you could kind of bring about spiritual reform in Indian society. But Dr. Ambedkar's critique is that you could bring about temple entry, but untouchability would continue to be practiced in terms of ghettoization, in terms of landlessness. And this was him anticipating that the constitutional abolition of untouchability would not be enough, that you would need a radical pedagogy, you would need a completely deep educational mission that could change the way people thought. And the problem was that people weren't thinking. So as you know, in the first talk that Dr. DuBois was saying, that the kind of sit-ins, the kind of protests that students were doing in the 1960s in the US made people think, that students were thinking. And even Annihilation of Caste, Dr. Ambedkar writes that the problem of caste is that upper castes and dominant castes just stop thinking, that they become ritualistic, that they just follow Manusmriti. And so one needs to kind of do public protest, one needs to read books, one needs to do, the Mahat Satyagraha, like kind of access to water movements, access to school movements, to make people think that they're practicing untouchability. They're practicing not a public or a social form of relationality. So as Dr. Ambedkar says in some of these quotations, that end osmosis makes possible a resocialization of once socialized attitudes. In place of the old, it creates a new like-mindedness, which brings together people. That education is part of, true education, true Ambedkar education needs to be part of an integrative agenda. That people must share in common, which they don't in Hinduism, aims, beliefs, aspirations, knowledge, a common understanding, and they must become like-minded. And the problem of how to become like-minded is the problem that Dr. Ambedkar and Dr. DuBois are thinking about in their educational writings. So in terms of Dr. DuBois's trajectory, sorry, just went out of full screen. He was born in Massachusetts, so in the northeast of the US. In 1868, he was born to a single mother. So she did a lot of work in kind of raising him. In Fisk, he went to Fisk University, Nashville. It was a predominantly Black college, 1885 to 1888. Then he went to Harvard in 1888 to 1890, did a PhD there, went to Berlin in 1892 to 1894. Similar to Dr. Ambedkar, had a very global life. And then he went to Wilberforce University in Ohio, so in the middle of the US, and taught there. It's another historically Black college. In 1895, there was a Booker T. Washington's Atlantic Compromise. Booker T. Washington was a leader in the South who had a very different vision for education, very different vision for Black liberation, where he believed that you can't fight the political battle against these white supremacists. They're so hateful, they're so bad, that if they're giving us, if they're giving Black people some amount of economic safety through jobs, maybe that's where we can start, because you can't expect political rights in the situation that we're in. And in 1990, he founds Crisis, similar to how Dr. Ambedkar founds Bahishkrit Bharat and Mook Nayak. Dr. Du Bois founds Crisis in 1910. In London, there's the Pan-African Congress, where he connects with African leaders and tries to plan African anti-colonial movements. In 1926, he visits USSR, Union of Soviet Social Republics. He even visits Xinjiang, Beijing, goes to Japan, and returns to Atlanta in 1936. There's another Pan-African Congress in 1945, and he basically becomes super concerned at the war between Soviet Union and the US. He's concerned there's going to be a nuclear war. There's going to be a war against all countries, between all countries. And in the time we're living today, it's a very living concern. And he starts advocating for peace. But when he starts advocating for peace, the US government starts seeing him as a foreign agent, as a, anti-national. And so he gets charged, he gets his passport taken away, he has to serve in hearings. But once he gets his passport back, they don't find anything about him. He goes to Ghana and he dies in Ghana in 1962. And this is a picture of Du Bois in the offices of the Crisis. So I wanted to kind of really ground us. The reason why I shared all these other voices rather before getting to Dr. Du Bois and Dr. Ambedkar was that they were part of larger movements. And they articulated the ideas of those movements in really beautiful and stunning and clear ways. But they were members of larger movements, just like all of us are. And so in the US, I want to offer you all the context of what Du Bois was responding to. That what they were responding to was that Black Americans who were enslaved kept trying to fashion a system of formal education that allowed them to prefigure the liberation from peasantry, right? So what happened in the South, particularly for enslaved Black people, was that they were tenant farmers, landless workers, and they were denied the right to read, right? Like Frederick Douglass talks about how if anyone, similar to Manusmriti, if any Black person was caught teaching somebody to read, they would get severely punished, violently punished. And so when you look at the history of social movements and Black efforts to create a liberatory education for themselves, you also see that there were white philanthropists and planter and industrial elites who tried to contain these Black efforts for education, much like upper caste try to contain and don't allow kind of Dalits and Adivasis and OBCs to enter agraharams and universities. So in the 19th century, there was a massive grassroots campaign where there were designs for public education. So Dr. Du Bois writes in Black Reconstruction that the idea of the public school emerged in the South. The idea of the public school, that everyone can go to school. In the movement to abolish slavery. And I would argue the idea of the public school in South Asia emerged from Dalit students who were asking for the right to access school. But these efforts were retrenched brutally. So in 1862, the Civil War ended. A huge institution called the Freedmen's Bureau was created. A very, very, for Dr. Du Bois, it was one of the biggest institutions in the world. Imagine creating one ministry that was in charge of land redistribution, in charge of ensuring schooling, in charge of ensuring healthcare, in charge of ensuring housing for newly emancipated Black people. And this institution had a lot of government funding. And so it was completely changing the social fabric of Southern society. But of course, the white elites, the plantation owners, were super concerned. They were going to lose all their property. And so they used the mechanics of Congress, of electoral politics, much like we see in India today, to start kind of retrenching this Freedmen's Bureau and removing land distribution and creating a new counter-revolution of property, right? And Black people were meant to be property for white people. So new racial codes emerged. Jim Crow emerged. A new form of spatial segregation, of untouchability emerged. And so as a result, African Americans themselves engaged in debates about what does schooling mean for us when white elites are coming for us so hard, when white working class people are coming for us so hard. In this context, so they kind of thought about what kind of schools will bring about emancipation, what kind of universities will bring out emancipation. And so what the white elites developed, and this beautiful book by Joel Armstrong called The Educations of Black in the South. I'll send you the PDF. It's a really, really beautiful book. Similar to Dr. Shailaja Paik's book, Dalit Women's Education. It tracks the history of education on the ground, what was happening in 19th century, 20th century. That Samuel Chapman Armstrong, he was a very big philanthropist, kind of a Bill Gates of his time. He insisted that the newly freed people should not participate in voting. They should not participate in political life, because they were culturally and morally deficient. They were inferior. So they were unfit to hold office in civilized society. And what they tried to start creating was the Hampton Institute. So Booker T. Washington launched these new institutions, these new universities and colleges for kind of emergent Black middle classes. But when Henry M. Turner, a prominent Black leader, visited Hampton Institute, he said that they're either in the whole ex-slaveholders themselves or pandering to the spirit of slavery. The graduates cannot be called educated by any means because they've not been near the learning given by a respectable grammar school. Besides, I think colored children are taught to remember you are Negroes as such as your place is behind. So these were schools that were set up in the Hampton Institute or universities that were meant to train teachers that would then teach Black children that they were inferior. And this is documented. This is kind of what the white philanthropists were even saying. And it was in response to this, and in a sense, kind of developing the idea further. Andrew Carnegie, you might have heard Carnegie Mellon University, one of the most famous universities, in the US. He gave the endowment for the Tuskegee Institute. He gave the money, and this quotation is very striking. He says, "We cannot produce cotton for the wants of the world. We want America, like for Black Americans, to be where South Africa are." And we know about apartheid in South Africa. That South Africa is having to admit Chinese labor because too many of the Black people don't want to work as hard. And so they're creating divisions by race and caste by bringing in new workers. And so they want to create forms of Black education that tell Black children you don't have, you can't have anything more than a laborer's life. You just need to grow up to be a laborer. You just need to be a peaceful, docile, pliant laborer. And so in the 1910s to 1930s, there were expansions of schooling. That proportion of white boys and girls who were doing agricultural work, only 22% or 7%, whereas 49% of Black children were doing agricultural labor, 30% of Black girls were doing agricultural labor. And we can think about caste statistics today, about how much upper castes and kind of OBCs and Dalits and Adivasis are doing agricultural labor today. In that time, only 36% of Black children attended school. And so ordinary Black men and women, local white school officials, they engaged in the Rosenwald school building program. So they tried to create a universal schooling program for themselves, which Joel Anderson covers. But at the same time, when the schooling program tried to create industrial education, that, maybe we'll set up this educational system as a way to create jobs, there were no jobs because there was a Great Depression. And I think we should think about kind of vocational education programs now. Are there jobs for these vocational education programs that are being created? Because Black jobs are only those that were left after whites achieved full employment. So there were similar kind of caste social networks that prevented Black youth from actually getting jobs that they were industrially trained for. And that, in a sense, Bruce R. Payne responded to George R. James in the Federal Reserve Board. He said that the problems of the Negro schools and the white schools are not the same. And that if we train Negroes to live a life which human society forbids them to live after they're educated, I should expect that such educated persons will become Bolshevists, and it'll be our fault if they do. That there's something radical that if you train Black people to live a life that society forbids them to live, they might want something more from the world. They might change their politics. They might change what they desire. And it's similar to what Madhukar Takshande was saying about how books were central to the Ambedkar movement. When the books traveled to villages, you started having the Marathwada Andolan, you started having the movements. The books were central to expanding the imagination. And so Professor Shailja Paik talks about the militant optimism of the Ambedkarite vision of education, that both the modern state and upper caste elites hesitated to resolve the Dalit educational question because they wanted to exclude Dalits from the right to education, and they wanted to construct differences between castes. Dalits themselves had a tremendous hunger for education and continued to attain as much schooling as possible, despite the difficulties they entailed, because they believed in its modern promise, its significance for the existential freedom, and its power as a vehicle to social, economic, and political freedom, a way out and up from under. And kind of centering Dalit women's voices and how Dalit women and Dalit girls were central to this fight for education. It's important to bring up Muktabai Salve's critique of Brahmanism in 1855, where Brahmins refused to teach the Vedas to anybody else. That if merely looking at the Vedas can get us into grievous sins, then would not following them be the height of foolishness? What does it mean to follow a religion that you can't even intellectually inspect or critique? What is the kind of education that the Vedas and Manusmriti are offering is what Babasaheb is asking here. And in terms of the colonial state was very happy with continuing untouchability. Educational reformers attempted to build schools. G.K. Gokhale, Professor Pike kind of traces in her book that they tried to create schools that were accessible to all students, particularly Dalit students. And when Gandhi visited one of those students, he was also terrified of rebellion. That if you teach people in this way, they'll be rebelling against society. And Hari Narayan Apte responded, yes, let there be rebellion. That's exactly what I want. And I think, that's something I think about a lot as a teacher and kind of what the Ambedkarite and Black, philosophy education is about. And early on, villagers would boycott schools where Dalit students were admitted. And even today, one hears of atrocities when Dalit school children touch a bucket of water. They get beaten brutally, if not killed. So upper caste Hindus in colonial state constructed caste by constantly making competence that, arguments about competencies, they're not so smart, they're just hardworking. The school is not for them, they should do other things. So there was a long such struggle by Dalit students themselves in Forest Road School. So I want to just kind of read out this quotation that in Forest Road School, after the municipal government passed an order saying that there would be no discrimination of caste. This is from Professor Pak's book. The students themselves started challenging the contradiction between the theoretical rights and the everyday discrimination that they faced. So on 27 July 1929, some Dalit students drank water in lotis meant for the sprucia, meant for the touchables, in order to provoke Shri Katkul, the headmaster, into implementing 1923 legislation. He ignored them, nothing happened. On 29 July, the school peon refused to admit the Dalit students who were drunk from the untouchables lotis. This provoked another 10 or 20 students who proceeded to do the same. So the more you prevented students from trying to drink water, the more students tried. This led to a disturbance, a gadabad in the school. At once, the headmaster called the suspicious students and questioned them. What will you achieve if you drink water like this? Dalit students. Until today, we've been insulted and this act will undo that. If you start drinking water like this, the touchables will leave school. What about that? And the Dalits responded, if touchable students want to follow caste discrimination, they should not attend municipal schools at all. They should go to other schools. But if they do so, we will follow them there. So they're kind of saying that, that they need to kind of abolish untouchability in everyday practice to make possible public schools. Because these schools are not public, they're private. They belong, even municipal schools that are kind of technically for everybody are seen as belonging to upper castes, and upper castes are trying to kind of own these schools. And this was kind of Dr. DuBois' critique of the Hampton idea and of Booker T. Washington's philosophy, that he says at a speech in 1906 in his beautiful book Education of Black People, that in an institution where the president of the US can tell young men not to hitch their wagons to a star but to a mule, not to dream about the stars but to kind of become peasants. And this reminds me of, Rohit Vemula's final letter about, being made of the stars. Where a sincere old man can say amid laughter that the great duty of a minister is to teach his flock to raise a good dinner. And where all in all, there's an insistence in practicality in a manner and tone that would make Socrates an idiot and Jesus Christ a crank. That everyone's saying practicality, practicality, practicality. And so someone like Socrates or Jesus are just, cranks and idiots. If you have good values, if you have to free society, it's completely unthinkable. In such a place, this kind of doctrine is so fundamentally false, I should call for a word of warning, as DuBois says. And similarly, Dr. Ambedkar believes that's the problem of the Brahmin intellectual class, right? That because they're the only intellectual class who run society, they have an interest in perpetuating hierarchy in how they teach their students. So Brahmin teachers will keep an eye that, okay, who's Dalit, who's not Dalit, and who has a right to think and who doesn't have a right to think. That there's no Hindu society, that it's merely a collection of castes. And a Brahmin philosophy of education precluded this. And so towards a philosophy of liberatory education, for both Dr. DuBois and Dr. Ambedkar, caste determined the allocation of scarce social resources toward the education self-development of dominant caste minorities. And that it consisted of emptying out and denying social resources, education self-development of the vast majority of the oppressed. A liberatory system of education that needs to be organized around the needs of the most marginalized. And finally, education by itself cannot resolve the political economic contradictions that are imposed by capitalist labor markets, right? If there aren't enough jobs, then what are you going to do? We have to kind of look at the intervention at the economic level. And so, in a sense, this is kind of how Dr. DuBois continues, that let there be no misunderstanding about this, no easygoing optimism. We are not going to share modern civilization by deserving recognition. We're going to force ourselves in by organized, far-seeing effort, by outthinking and outflanking the owners of the world, who are too drunk with their arrogance and power successfully to oppose us, if we think and learn and do. And so I kind of wanted to just kind of cite some important books that formed my own thinking, and end with Bipitai Kamble's beautiful book, The Prisons We Broke, where she talks about her own participation in the education struggle, similar to, what Madhukar Takshande was saying in the beginning, that Dalit women took on the responsibility of educating their children. And that once they're educated, they'll benefit their community, and the next generation will benefit their community. And that's the legacy where, that makes possible our gathering today. And that sisters and mothers will carry out this task with the iron resolve, the strength of Dalit women, right? Like even in the first video we were seeing. And so a big part of my project comes from how contemporary conditions of hyper-privatization of educational institutions are creating new ideologies of caste, merit and Hindutva, and there's beautiful critiques of merit, across the Ambedkarite literature, and racial hierarchy. So new white supremacist, anti-Semitic, anti-queer, anti-feminist, Islamophobic discourses that create new criminality, that students, if they behave badly, if they protest too much, if they speak up for Palestine, they're problematic, and they should be disciplined and they should be punished. And there's new philanthropists. There's the Bill Gates Foundation. There's other large philanthropists and owners of the world who want to privatize education, and they want to sell the model of consumption. They don't want people to think and act, as we were seeing at the beginning of the talk. They want people to consume something on their phone, consume a video, and go back to their isolated, laboring lives. At the same time, there's a kind of contradictory effort in elite institutions such as University of Chicago, where I've done my PhD, that are trying to develop radical discourses and new ideas, but they never share their ideas beyond their campus walls. They have their conferences in their own places. They have their own little elite caste networks. And the actual education is happening in spaces like this that we're part of, which I feel so grateful to be part of. Is happening in Ambedkarite study groups, Periyarite study groups, in prisons, in Black study groups in prisons. Prisoners are reading books. Ambedkarite booksellers, Periyarite booksellers, they're actually teaching, Buddha and his Dhamma. They're teaching Dr. Ambedkar's writings. They're teaching Savitribai Phule's writings. They're teaching Muktabai Salve's writings. They're having debates about race and caste. You don't need to kind of be in hyper-elite institutions to be doing radical work. And I'd argue the more radical work is happening on the ground. But I'd be really curious to hear your thoughts on that. And there's a way in which being on the ground is also very violent and, very risky. And it's very different for, say, I would argue for Dalit students or Muslim students to be safe from that violence, because violence doesn't give you a space to think, if you're constantly feeling contempt. But I was giving, another version of this talk to University of Chicago audience. So I wanted them to know that they're not the kings of the world, So I have a little bit more material, but I wanted to leave space for questions. I just want to share a little bit from Dr. DuBois' speech, The Field and Function of the Negro College, where he argues that you need education suited to the needs of Black people. And for him, his models of education were what he saw in West Africa, where children learned from their parents how to take care of themselves, attended village councils. Whereas in Western society, the small educated group, say in Eton or Harrow or Oxford or Cambridge or, Ashoka or Jindal, the small educated group sees that they think they're the whole of the society, despite the fact that they're a small minority. And so they start speaking for the nation. This was Dr. Ambedkar's critique of Gandhi. And so this form of education forces suppressed groups to despise life, because they're not been educated to ideal of equal social relationships. And it makes the university a system of culture for the cultured. So in elite universities, you get emptiness and airy abstraction. You see self-segregating elites that don't even understand people outside their bubbles. So healthy democratic societies need to build universities informed by the ideal of the Bush School. And I just want to bring out this quotation that when he's talking about education, he brings up the question of caste. So Dr. DuBois says, it's not ours to argue whether we will be segregated or whether we ought to be a caste. We are segregated, we are a caste. This is our given and present unalterable fact. Our problem is how far and in what way can we consciously and scientifically guide our future so as to ensure our physical survival, our spiritual freedom, and our social growth. Either we do this or we die. And so caste is the idea of intellectual inferiority and superiority is how education inculcates and can be a site of domination. But the idea of bringing out equal social relationships, how Dalit communities organize people, education society, how they build residential schools, hostels, libraries, how they set up funds and scholarships. It communicated the sacred quality of the pursuit of knowledge. And so the fight against caste for both Dr. DuBois and Dr. Ambedkar was a fight to learn, to the right to learn freely for all human beings, the right to learn and the right to think. So I'll stop there for now. I want to thank you all for this opportunity. I'm really curious to hear your thoughts and questions. So yeah, Jai Bhim, and thanks so much for this opportunity again.
Wow, that was such an engaging discussion, and I even forgot that I was moderating. I was so indulged in the article. It was so in depth. I'm sure the audience would have a few interesting questions, and I also have myself a few questions, but I'll go for the audience. So those who have questions, please either you can unmute yourself and speak, or you can ask question in the chat. So, do you have questions?
Hello.
Yes, Varsh.
Am I audible?
Yeah, you are audible.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Uday, for a very edifying talk of. There are a couple of things that I want to start, and I think it comes from a place of being somebody who actually discovered DuBois and Ambedkar archive. I and Mangesh Daivale, both of us, after a spell of like it was completely invisibilized. So I see a problem in terms of the whole archives that Dalit Ambedkarites, and I would not say just, I would like to just say as Ambedkarites, that we have been preserving this archive. We've always been an epistemic community. But in terms of higher education and theorization, it's always this extraction and appropriation that we are witnessing. So in case of like DuBois and Ambedkar archive, S.D. Kapoor wrote about it first. Then Gayatri is taught a course about it, and now there's kind of it just keeps on multiplying, but also with the situated knowledge and the extraction and appropriation that happens in higher education, which DuBois was also against. That is why he kind of started this program for the blacks, as well as for Ambedkar also started this educational program exclusively for these people who are not represented or discriminated. So that also comes to the second part when you said about right to think. And I think I've read this in Anupama Rao's work as well, that there's this tendency of comparing the American context with the Indian. I have to still come across somewhere where Dalits have been berated as inferiors, intellectually inferiors, because all we see is like, even right to think. Regardless of whether Brahmins gave right to think or not, Mukta Sarve went and questioned Vedas. And even before her, there were many untouchable caste women who were doing it. So that's the point that I really want to highlight is this is importing of American scientific racism and implementing or trying to frame India and especially untouchables. So that's second. And the last one I want to really bring out the difference is also this tendency of trying to forcefully bring Ambedkar and DuBois. When we see there's a paper by Ladit Khandare and Professor Kevin Brown, who have clearly articulated how DuBois and Ambedkar don't see each other, despite Ambedkar trying very best to reach out to DuBois, but DuBois was interested somewhere else. And that brings to the question of communism. At the age of 93, DuBois becomes a communist. He enrolls for the Communist Party, whereas Ambedkar is very, very clear about his agenda, right from Yevla to conversion. His path is Buddhism. So that's the last point that I want to raise is that, again, it's kind of an Americanization of knowledge of untouchables and the blacks trying to just, I think we need to highlight the tensions as well, that the Black Solidarity movement was towards Gandhi and not towards Babasaheb when he was alive. So yeah, that's it. And the last point again, I also want to say that you mentioned little meanness. How is it little meanness? Proper discrimination, segregation, not allowing human race people to come and access this space. How do you call it even little meanness? I have problems by stating that as little meanness. This is a violent discrimination. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much, Varsha. Can I take like multiple questions and then I can
Sure.
respond like, yeah.
Okay. I would also request everyone to be like precise, to be short, so that we can cover as many questions as we can. So yeah, Rajen Kashyap, you have your hand raised.
My question is that Babasaheb Ambedkar has written in 1917, caste, its origin and genesis, vis-a-vis slavery, which has been practiced for 500 years in Western world. In both system, woman is the captive, and the whole structure of slavery as well as caste is erected on her only. If we read the paper Caste, Its Origin, Genesis, we'll find out that a woman is the foundational brick who has been used to erect the structure of caste and varna in Hindu system. In from say 3,000 years maybe back. Same is the case with black slavery. In American example of upliftment of blacks, there are various approaches, and Uday has tried to cover DuBois approach, and he also talked about Booker T. Washington. In his book Up From Slavery, he has discussed his approach. Whereas there are scholars in USA who are black, like Harriet Beecher, who has written Uncle Tom's Cabin. Her approach is altogether different. King's approach is different. So therefore, blacks vis-a-vis Dalit, I think the comparison is not straitjacket comparison. Why? Because blacks from the color of their skin are identifiable, and they are a group. They may be Christian, they may be Muslim, but they are black and they are African American, coming from African continent mostly. So therefore, whereas that similarity is not there in Dalits. So Dalits are various groups. They are broken people, as Babasaheb Ambedkar has written, who are untouchables. So they still are broken people. The initiatives which is there to educate them. If we see the condition of people education society in Maharashtra, there are so many segmentation, and that one of the biggest perhaps educational society in Asia, its condition is so pathetic today. The colleges and the schools and the institution which it runs are in real shambles, because infight among those management fellows is so deep that it does not allow it to move forward. So therefore, this hegemony of certain communities among us, the Dalit itself, actually brings their cause to very down. Therefore, that may not be the condition with black people. They are united on the basis of their color of their skin, as well as their spiritual and social belief. So therefore, straight jacket and one-to-one comparison may not be, say, possible. And Phule, Mahatma Jyotirao Phule, when Dhananjay Keer has written his biography, in that biography, in say 19th century, the struggle which Phule has waged for setting up a public school is so mammoth that that kind of struggle may not have been there in USA for black people. So therefore, state and one-to-one comparison is not possible.
Rajan,
Yes.
I would like to be precise on the question, because we have so many questions, so we would not want anyone to be missing out. Please.
So I have concluded. My question is that straitjacket comparison is not at all possible, and comparison between black people and Dalits, I think straitjacket, there is no formula, because Dalit are not one people; they are still broken people, and their loyalties towards spiritual and social beliefs are different.
Okay. Next, Jessica. Jessica, go on. Please be like precise and short. Thank you.
Thank you. So I just wonder, thank you so much for your presentation. I just wonder what your thoughts on most recent developments about caste and race, the discussion, especially Isabel Wilkinson's book, Caste or the Discontent of Origin, and the edited volume by Anand Chaltunde and Surajyande, The Radical in Ambedkar, that I think is pushing in this direction, not straightjacket kind of comparison, but like connected thinking of the strategies of domination, strategies of overcoming this domination. And possibly if you have extra time and if you know about Cedric Robinson's kind of a Black Marxism that traces racial capitalism before the Atlantic slave trade, and then what does it mean if we can connect those domination strategies from caste and race all the way back to, I don't know, 3,000 years. Thank you.
Okay, would you like to answer these many questions? Because we have also a bunch of more questions. So should we go all in, or you will answer the first three questions?
Yeah, I can answer the first three questions. So I'll answer them briefly, and I can share my email address, and I'd love to have more conversations with, with anybody if you're interested. I feel like this work is very early stage of development, and I think it only grows with more conversations and more dialogue. First of all, I think Varsha's question is absolutely on point. I think that the question of like appropriation, the question of like who profits from the caste race comparison is absolutely relevant, and like I try my best to I think Balmurali Natarajan has this wonderful definition of caste as monopolization. The caste is monopolization of power, of privilege, monopolization of resources. So I do my utmost best to be accountable and to improve my citation practices. I'm really excited to read the articles that you suggested, Varsha, that I totally missed in my research, particularly the the S.D. Kapoor articles and the other articles. I'd love to hear like other things that I could read to kind of enrich my argument. And yeah, by the little meannesses, I really just meant how much the violence, the kind of total social violence manifests itself in small ways that aren't really small, but like, like a microaggression isn't really a microaggression. It's utter dehumanization. So yeah, but I appreciate you kind of, asked me to clarify my language on that. And yeah, I think in a sense, when I wrote my dissertation, I was writing it for an American audience and for a very skeptical kind of academic committee that kind of didn't see any conversation or dialogue that could be possible. And so in the way I've conceptualized so far, I've mostly like tried to find points of similarity or points of connection, basically, like in what way do Dalits see a parallelity or some conversation, some kinship, some sense of connection with Black people, and vice versa. But I think the questions from Rajendra Kashyap and Varsha are absolutely right, where it's actually when you acknowledge differences that the strength of the conversation become deeper. And particularly in terms of differences, say, between Ambedkar's own journey, Dr. Ambedkar's own journey away from, like not towards communism, but towards Buddhism, and like what does the dialogue between Buddhism and communism enable, right? Like for me, I genuinely believe that kind of Black leftists or communists or any political trajectory can learn a lot from Buddhist ethics and can learn a lot from Buddhist theology, and vice versa in terms of like how to organize institution, how to organize unity, how to organize like a democratic society in terms of political economy and understanding kind of like I think vice versa, like Buddhists can also learn from other political traditions, including the left tradition. I feel like we're at a point where we need to learn from each other. We need to learn to talk to each other. And so insofar as my work is allowing that and making that possible, I'm doing a good job. But if there's ways in which I'm framing questions or like oversimplifying narratives that's not making dialogue possible, then I'm failing. And I need to know as soon as possible so that I'm not disabling conversation, but rather enabling conversation, right? So I'll just kind of pause there. But yeah, I'll share my email on the chat, and I'd love to kind of, be in more conversation with anyone who doesn't have a chance to ask questions. So yeah, I'm eager to hear more questions. I have time now.
Okay, Chitij, you can ask your question.
Yes. Sir, amazing talk, by the way. I have 3 questions and I would keep it very short. Okay. So my first question is, like, what are the similarities and differences between the Nation of Islam and Ambedkar's conversion to Buddhism? The second is, like, where do you see Dalit art is today on a national and global platform when we compare it to Black arts? The third question is, why in a racist society, Black people are often stereotyped as aggressive, whereas in a caste society, Dalit people are often seen as docile and submissive? These are my 3 questions.
Oh, these are fantastic questions. And also, should I respond to these 3 questions and Jessica's question, or are there any more questions?
We have one question on chat.
Okay.
Nisha, can you? Yeah. Oh, you are. Your voice is not.
Okay, so am I audible?
Yeah.
So we have a question from Prashant. So his question is, what do you think about the W.E.B. Du Bois idea of double conciseness in Indian context?
Yeah, we have so many questions. You can answer.
Okay, I'll answer them. So yeah, I'll start with Jessica's question about Cedric Robinson and Black Marxism. So absolutely, like I really love the book Black Marxism. It really informed my own thinking. And the argument that Cedric Robinson makes in that book is that Europeans had created, before even they enslaved Africans, they created a caste system within Europe. And what happened was that feudal caste system they then already had in place. So when they encountered Africans in their trading voyages, they just said, okay, these people are the laborers and we can kind of exploit them and create a new empire from their labor. And we can kind of take them to North America, take away land from indigenous people of North America, and, and do a genocide of indigenous people as well as of Black people. So I really appreciate the suggestion, Jessica, that there's a way in which Cedric Robinson's Black Marxism can be brought in conversation with Dr. Ambedkar's history of Buddhism, right? And like why Brahmanism had to fight and struggle against Buddhism to create small caste monopolies in Indian society. So I think there's definitely ways in which, those two can be brought in conversation to say that race and caste are 2000-year institutions. In terms of more recent work, one thing I find very powerful in, so Isabel Wickerson's book, I think maybe falls prey to what Rajendra was sharing about kind of one-to-one comparisons that can be simplifying and kind of can obscure what's happening. But I really loved Ava DuVernay's film. I really recommend you watching it. I think it's online, because I think what she was showing was a visual vocabulary of seeing oppression, I think that we live, this kind of relates to the, I think Kshitij's question about Dalit art, is that in this hyper Bollywoodized, hyper consumerist, hyper romantic world we live in, our eyes get trained to invisibilize oppression when it happens, to invisibilize caste when it happens. And of course, I think upper caste and dominant caste even more so. And like there's a way in which Dalits can't afford to look away because it's happening to them. And this relates to, I think, double consciousness as well. But in terms of popular art, if one gets used to seeing each own, like I taught Frantz Fanon's Black Skin, White Masks. And in that book, Fanon connects the oppression of the Vietnamese with the Martinicans, with the Senegalese, with the Madagascar people, and with the Jews. He connects all of them. And all my students were very uncomfortable that he was connecting, oh, but I thought anti-Semitism was different, and I thought what happened to Asians was different. But he said structurally it was the same. A colonial power went in, created a local elite, and massacred the poor, and they massacred the workers. They massacred them. They believed they could die. It's similar to what Israel's doing in Palestine. If you can't see that structure, you can't see the connections between that structure, how will we even rise up together, right? I think, like Rajendra raised a really great question about the division of, and like, it's not for me to comment about like divisions within Dalit movement, but I would say the divisions between upper caste kind of spaces, or divisions like between dominant caste left communities, right? I think division is a cross caste issue, which is caused by a lack of art, a lack of knowledge, a lack of education that makes us see what's common in each other, and also sees what different in each other, right, in ways that is productive. So yeah, I think like in terms of thinking about the other questions I think Kshitij raised, similarities and differences from Nation of Islam and Buddhism. I think I'm not qualified because I've not read too much of the history of Nation of Islam. I've read a little bit more on the history of like kind of, Ambedkarite Buddhism. Maybe one similarity is that both were meant to be universalists. But like I think Nation of Islam was especially Africanist. But Islam is the universalist religion, but became kind of raceized and casteized. In terms of Dalit art on the global context, I think there's this beautiful Panther's publication book, 20 Telugu Dalit short stories. And in the preface for that book, the translator, I forget his name, it's a beautiful book. I recommend you all get from Panther's Paul. He says that there are at least 23 Dalit subcastes in Telugu, in Telangana, Andhra Pradesh, who've not got one book published in that subcaste, in the Dalit subcaste. And I'm sure that's the case for Adivasi subcaste, Adivasi communities. I'm sure that's the case for Dalit communities, across India. And so I think we've not even begun to hear, echoing Varsha's question, we've not even begun to hear Dalit voices on the global stage. And we need to work very, very hard, in elite institutions and every institution, to change that, to challenge that, to make possible more art, more more thinking, more thought that's contextually grounded, that's kind of, not exploited or appropriated, but respected. And yeah, finally, in terms of the question of in a racist society, Black people are seen as aggressive, whereas Dalits are seen as docile. I think that's a very, very deep question about graded hierarchy, right? And this is another important question many people raise, the difference between South Asia and US. That in a sense, Black people are at the bottom of a racial order, but the racial order, while it is hierarchical, it's not graded hierarchical. Whereas Dalits are at the bottom of a graded hierarchical social order, where there's so many levels of disrespect and contempt, as Dr. Mik says, descending level of contempt, descending level of respect, that those near the top or even those near the middle really believe those below them to be completely servile and completely docile and not responsive. And I also think there's a way in which I think Dr. Ambedkar talks about annihilation of caste, the lack of arms, right? Like Dalits have not been allowed to have arms to protect themselves. And this is what kind of Chandrasekhar Azad and Bhim Army and Samta Sainik Dal have been challenging. But in a sense, in the Black movement, the Black Panther movement in the 60s and 70s, Black, self-defense is a very big part of the Black tradition. And so I think the police and American media often frame kind of strong Black voices as aggressive because they are in the legacy of slavery. Like they don't want a Black revolt, a Black uprising. And I think, similar to kind of, back to Rajendra's question of what is the fear of Dalit uprising that's being denied by imagining a kind of, because on the other hand, I would say that there's a way in which there's upper caste fragility, right? Where if a Dalit person asks an upper caste person, just a basic intellectual question, the upper caste person might think, oh, you're being aggressive, you're being angry, So there's a way in which that same entitlement, that same moral superiority manifests in anger. But you're right that overall, in terms of social attitudes, there's an expectation of docility, and the expectation of docility creates the shock of when someone thinks, when someone critiques, it's this person is speaking kind of out of their boundaries. So, but yeah, that's a very deep question. I'll think about it much more. I hadn't really thought of it until you suggested it. Yeah, I'll stop there.
Yeah, do we have any more questions? Do we have time, Uday, I have few, 2 questions. So
yeah, I'm not in a rush. Yeah, I have time.
Okay, so this is from a personal experience, and I am living in JNU, and IIT Delhi is nearby, the Indian Institute of Technology. So both have a different environment in terms of how Dalit students are facing challenges. Obviously, in JNU, there is a case of problematic exploitation, and it is increasing because of the changing pattern of examination and all. But they have an assertive group there. They have student unions. The recent student union president is the Dalit student. But when I see the case from IIT Delhi, that is a natural science specialized premier institute. So in that, even professors who get the mails of Dalit students, that they are being exploited by students because of the quota and the reservation that they have been. They do not deserve this place. So with that context, I have two questions. First, do we see this kind of divide on natural science institute and social science institute in case of black African Americans? And second, do we need to dwell deeper into terms of what education does this mean? Because at one end we have both are considered education, but both have different approaches into dealing with the issue of caste. So thank you.
Thank you so much. Can I ask for clarification? So, like, if I understood right, is it the case that IIT and natural sciences have like really most like worse casteism than social sciences, or different kind of casteism than social sciences?
I believe casteism is the same. I think this is institutional casteism in IIT. In case of the social sciences institution, there exists this kind of institutional barriers in terms of admission, but students are more active there. In the case of natural science IITs, students are not active and they are not even given, a space to speak up. So institutional barriers are there. So.
Oh, absolutely. Okay, so I think what I'm getting from the question is that there's a way in which scientific discourse, I think Rennie Thomas writes beautifully about science and caste in India. There's a way in which like the idea of objective scientific discourse allows for Brahminical ideology to be practiced, and then denies when in IIT, if you get an Ambedkar Periyar reading circle, it gets heavily policed, and it's like it's very, very tough for students to even raise a voice, where in social science institutions you have much more social critique. I think in the US, it's a challenge. Racism in the sciences is a huge challenge that basically it's a huge challenge in natural science universities in the US, but there are kind of like efforts for bringing out the race question in the sciences. There's this beautiful book by Chanda Prescott-Weinstein. I'll put it in the chat, where she's kind of thinking about her experience as a Black Jewish woman as a quantum physicist and a scientist. And so, like, I think historically Black universities have thought a lot about questions of sciences and how to direct science. Also, there's a big history of racist science, like in casteist science, right? Like medical experimentation on Black people, just like, my colleague Sanghamitra Das, she writes about the medical exploitation of Dalits and Adivasis in, across India. And so like, there's a kind of very, very unique history in terms of relationship to the sciences that I can share more about in the future. But I think you're right that there's a way in which scientific discourse kind of closes out political and social questions, which we need to kind of really challenge in both scientific institutions and kind of, social scientific institutions.
Okay, thank you for this session. It was a very insightful and very discussion, very enlightening.
Oh, one sec, Pratik. I wanted to ask Varsha, I'd be really happy to hear more thoughts or questions or comments if you like. Yeah.
Thanks so much, Uday. Well, I just have a comment that you mentioned about citation practices, and I'm learning it from the left and from the Brahminism. Citations is not enough. We need co-production of knowledge.
Absolutely. Massive respect for that point. I think about that as well. And yeah, please, like, my email is in the chat. Please get in touch. And I feel like co-production of knowledge is really where the revolution happens. So I absolutely agree. Thank you for
that. Thank you.
Okay, do we have any more questions? I don't think so in the chat.
There is a question in chat box.
There is a cat. Yeah. So the question is can Ambedkarite self-determination find its authentic expression within the Brahminical Marxism? The presentation by Dr. Minal highlighted some sensitive insights from a Mumbai-based institute as well. From the Govind, this question is from Govind.
Thank you, Govind. That's a really excellent question. So I think Brahminical Marxism, I think it was already, tells us that like if you have a Brahminical Communist Party and you have Brahminical student groups where, people are exercising contempt and disrespect, where people are not taking caste seriously, where people are just believing that you can kind of decastize in very superficial and fake ways, then of course, Ambedkar's self-determination can't find self-authentic expression or any self-determination, right? Because that space belongs to the Brahminical elites. So my own intuition is that any form of political movement works through contradictions, that we live, that, that the institutions and the fragmentation of power is so much that that there's contradictions of caste and patriarchy, there's contradictions of class that need to be worked through with mutual respect and dignity, that need to be worked through with the Buddhist ethos of, compassionate joy, Buddhist ethos of loving kindness. In fact, I would argue that, maybe Brahminical Marxists have more to learn from Buddhists and vice versa in terms of their ethics, in terms of how they argue, in terms of how they, how they divide people, how they create dogmatism. But I would argue that at the same time, what Marxism offers as a method, as a practice, as a practical question, not just like a organizational question, like one doesn't need to join a communist party to learn from Marxism, is an analysis of how ownership is working, right? How is value being extracted? How is cost cutting by firms enabling the exploitation of particular workers? How is contract labor, particularly say, yesterday, Professor Ramasamy Mahalingam was talking about how more contract labor is given to Dalit janitors, and then when you give temporary contract labor, you can kind of abuse their safety even more, and you can give less wages. So to pay attention to the legal aspect, to pay attention to the labor exploitation, to pay attention to the fact that you can unite workers to put pressure on an employer to get better wages, you don't have to be called Marxist to do that. I would argue that Marx's method allows us to see that. But absolutely, you're right. I don't think Brahminical Marxism offers anybody freedom, and we should definitely, put that in the past. Neither does white Marxism. And the problem in the US, many white Marxists believe that race is, not too important, and we shouldn't focus on atrocities against Black people. So yeah, I think it's a really great question, Govind, and it's something we need to be working through in our own ways, in our own spaces, and it's a very, very sensitive and kind of important question. So thank you for raising it.
Okay, so I think we will be concluding this session. It was a great talk, and the engagement was very. You can reach out to Uday. He has provided the mail, and so this was a great discussion, and we talked about how the voice of marginalized, where the liberatory education or a philosophy of liberatory education provided by DuBois and Ambedkar gives a potential weapon for emancipation of both African Americans, Blacks in US and other areas, and as well as the Dalits in South Asia. So it was very insightful talk, and thank you everyone. Thank you, thank you, Nisha, and all the. Nisha would like to give a thank you note to everyone. So, Nisha.
Thank you, Pratik. So, all the participants present here, thank you for joining today's insightful session, led by Uday Jain, where we explore the thought-provoking ideas of Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar and DuBois. Uday's expertise and guidance enrich our understanding, particularly highlighting the importance of education in challenging social norms. We extend our sincere gratitude to Uday for his enlightening insights and to each of you for your active participation. Your engagement underscores the significance of these discussions in our ongoing pursuit of social justice. We have another session on tomorrow with Rajkumar Hans on the topic Babasaheb Ambedkar and Sikhism, and another one with Scott's on the topic Power of Ambedkar's pragmatism. So thank you.
Thank you all, Jai Bhim, and I look forward to more conversations in the future.
Thank you. Thank you.